My name is Emily Carter. I am 27 years old, and on the morning of my mother's funeral, I learned what real humiliation feels like, the kind that crawls under your skin and settles in your bones, the kind that comes not from strangers, but from the very people who share your blood. Snow was falling in slow, heavy flakes outside St. Mary's Chapel, sticking to the sleeves of my black dress as I stood shivering on the church steps, clutching the small bouquet of lilies I had saved for this one last goodbye, only to be told I was not welcome. My brother Michael, 34, and always the self-appointed guardian of the Carter family legacy, blocked the doorway with his arm outstretched as if I were a trespasser rather than his sister. His voice was calm, measured, rehearsed loud enough for every guest within earshot to hear. "You should leave, Emily. You were not here for her. You do not get to pretend today." Behind him, his wife Vanessa smirked with a satisfaction so sharp it could cut glass adjusting her designer coat as she whispered to a cluster of relatives who immediately turned their eyes away from me like I was something embarrassing that had blown in with the storm. I felt the sting rise in my throat as Michael pulled the chapel door closed, shutting me out of the warmth, the music, the prayers, the memory of the woman I loved more than anyone else in the world. I pressed my palm flat against the wooden door as if I could push my way through sheer force of grief, but my legs trembled under me and my breath clouded in the freezing air. I thought the worst part was being forbidden to say goodbye to my own mother, but then the guests began to file past one by one, offering awkward glances, pitying looks, murmured excuses, as though I deserved this exile. My fingers were numb around the lilies when a man in a dark overcoat stepped beside me, his voice low and steady as he removed his hat. "Miss Carter, I am Jonathan Hale, your mother's attorney. I have something for you, something she wanted you to receive today." And in that moment, as the chapel door closed behind my brother's perfect life, I realized the funeral was not an ending at all, but the beginning of a truth I was never meant to uncover. People often say grief blurs memories, but for me, it sharpened everything, every past slight, every whispered comparison. Every moment I learned my place in the Carter family was somewhere behind my brother's shadow. And as I stood outside that chapel with Jonathan Hale's unexpected presence beside me, the scenes of my childhood rose with brutal clarity, reminding me that this exile had been years in the making. Not an isolated cruelty, but the natural evolution of a family that had always measured worth through Michael. When I was 12 and he was 19, he was already the chosen one, the responsible one, the one adults praised at every holiday dinner while I was the afterthought, the kid who played quietly in corners and overheard my aunt's sigh that at least Linda had one child to be proud of. It was not that our mother did not love me, she did deeply, but she was worn down by life by the early death of our father, by hospital shifts that bled into more shifts by the pressure of raising 2 children alone, one of whom demanded more from her than she could ever give. Michael stepped into the role of man of the house with an eagerness that looked like devotion but felt more like domination, telling relatives what Mom needed before she could speak, telling me what chores were mine, telling everyone how hard he worked to keep the family afloat, even though half of his stories were exaggerated and the other half were outright lies. By the time I was 16, it was easier to stay silent than to correct him, easier to let the spotlight blind everyone to the truth that I was the one taking our mother to physical therapy appointments. I was the one cooking her meals when arthritis made her hands shake. I was the one sitting with her in the quiet evenings when Michael announced he was too busy with work to visit. Mom would squeeze my hand and whisper, "Thank you, sweetheart," but never out loud where it mattered. Never in front of the relatives whose approval Michael harvested like trophies, never in front of Vanessa, who entered our lives when I was 21 and immediately claimed authority she had not earned. Vanessa had a talent for manipulation that complemented Michael's need for control, and together they crafted a narrative in which I was irresponsible, emotional, inconsistent, someone who could not be relied upon during Mom's declining health. A narrative I was too exhausted to fight because I was spending every spare hour helping Mom climb in and out of bed, managing her medications, and soothing her when night terrors came after chemotherapy sessions. When Mom's illness worsened 2 years ago, I moved back into her home without being asked, sacrificing my job at the bakery, my social life, my small but hopeful dream of one day owning a cafe. And I never told a soul because Mom begged me not to start a war with Michael, begged me to let her keep the fragile peace she believed mattered more than fairness. So I kept my mouth shut while Michael visited once every 2 weeks with takeout boxes he barely opened and snapped photos to post online with captions like "quality time with Mom," while Vanessa called to remind me pointedly that hospice decisions were not mine to make. And now, standing in the cold outside the chapel, the weight of all those sacrifices pressed down on me with crushing force, because despite everything I had done for our mother, despite every small act of care, I was still the one left outside, while Michael played the grieving son inside those warm, stained glass walls. Jonathan watched me carefully, his breath fogging in the winter air as he shifted the leather folder under his arm. "Your mother was proud of you, Emily, more than you know. But she was also afraid you would never see your worth because of him." His words cracked something inside me, something brittle I had held together for too long, and as I stared at the chapel door where muffled hymns seeped through the wood, I understood with a new and painful clarity that the story Michael told the world, the story that led to this moment, where I was barred from my own mother's farewell, had been decades in the making, and the truth Jonathan carried might be the only thing strong enough to dismantle it. The invitation to my mother's funeral arrived 3 days after she passed, not through a phone call from my brother, not through a trembling voice message filled with shared grief, but in a stiff white envelope slid into my apartment mailbox like a bill, cold and impersonal, addressed to Miss Emily Carter as though I were a distant acquaintance, rather than the daughter who had slept in a recliner beside my mother's bed during her final months. And when I tore it open with shaking hands, the thin card inside felt heavier than stone. The front bore a photograph of St. Mary's Chapel, the church my mother loved but rarely attended, once her illness deepened, and beneath the printed schedule was a small, handwritten note in Vanessa's looping cursive, a note so sharp in its cruelty that my throat closed the moment I read it. "Please do not bring drama. Dress appropriately." It was not a request. It was a warning. A reminder that in Michael and Vanessa's version of the Carter family history, I was the unreliable daughter, the emotional inconvenience they tolerated only when necessary, and now that Mom was gone, even that tolerance had evaporated. I sat at my kitchen table for nearly an hour, staring at that card, rereading the quiet insult embedded in those 2 short sentences, feeling the old familiar ache of being invited but unwanted, included only to fulfill an obligation, never out of genuine connection. I knew I should have expected it. The past 2 years had been a cycle of Michael taking credit for decisions I made, Vanessa whispering to relatives that I was overstepping boundaries, and both of them positioning themselves as the faithful caregivers while I was painted as the unstable one who showed up only when convenient. They never visited on the nights Mom cried from the chemo. Byrne never saw how she clung to my arm when her legs trembled beneath her, never stayed up to monitor her breathing when pneumonia threatened to take her months earlier than it did. But somehow, they managed to be the ones praised at family gatherings, the ones photographed beside her, smiling weakly from the couch while I stood behind the camera unseen. The invitation was proof that the story Michael crafted had taken root deep enough that even in death he wanted to control who stood beside her coffin. I almost tore the card in half, almost threw it into the trash with the same dismissiveness it carried toward me, but something kept me from doing it. A stubborn insistence that whatever they thought of me, whatever lies they told, I had earned my place at my mother's farewell through every sleepless night. Every whispered reassurance, every sacrifice I had made without ever asking for recognition. So I ironed my black dress, the simple one Mom always said made me look like I had my life together, and I tied my hair back the way she preferred, neat and low, and I slipped the lilies between protective paper because she loved their scent, even when she was too weak to lift them. As I prepared to leave, my phone lit up with a single text from Michael, the first direct message from him in weeks. A message that made my stomach twist as soon as I read it. "Do not be late. We are starting on time. And remember what Vanessa wrote." The arrogance seeping through those words was so familiar it almost felt scripted, and for a fleeting second, I wondered if I should stay home. Spare myself the humiliation I sensed was coming, but grief is a stubborn thing, and love even more so. and I knew with absolute certainty that no matter how unwelcome I was made to feel, I could not let my mother be buried without seeing her one last time. I did not yet know that the funeral invitation was not a gesture of inclusion, but a setup for something far more vicious, something orchestrated to cement the story. Michael had spent years building a story where I was not just invisible but erased entirely. And as I locked my apartment door and headed into the cold morning air, I had no idea that the cruelest moment of that day was still waiting for me at the chapel steps. The first sign that something was terribly wrong at the funeral came before I even reached the church steps when I saw two security guards stationed outside the chapel doors as if this were a private gala instead of my mother's farewell, and one of them held a clipboard that he kept checking between glances at the arriving guests. I clutched the lilies tighter and approached, forcing my breath to steady, telling myself that I was her daughter and nothing, not even Michael's arrogance, could take that from me. But when the guard scanned the list and frowned, a cold bolt of dread shot down my spine. "Name, please," he said, and when I answered, his eyes flicked to the page again, then back to me with a discomfort that made my stomach twist. "You are not listed." I blinked at him, sure I had misheard. "I am her daughter. That should be enough." But he shook his head with the apologetic detachment of someone following orders he did not question. "I am sorry, Miss Carter. I cannot let you in unless your name is on this list." I could feel eyes turning toward me, curious, judgmental, pitying, as if I were some uninvited outsider who had shown up for attention rather than grief. And before I could say another word, Vanessa's too sweet voice drifted down the steps. "Oh dear, is there a problem?" She descended in her tailored black coat, perfectly styled for an occasion. She seemed to treat like a performance, and she placed a manicured hand on the guard's arm as she looked at me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Emily, did you not read the note I wrote? We wanted a peaceful service, no disruptions." I felt the world tilt. Disruptions. That was the word she used to describe me. The child who carried our mother to bed when her legs gave out, the one who cleaned her vomit without flinching, the one who stayed when everyone else left. I opened my mouth to argue, but she leaned closer, speaking softly enough that only I could hear her. "Michael said it would be better if you stayed out of sight today. You know how emotional you get." Emotional. The insult stung so sharply I almost gasped. She stepped back, plastering her sympathetic mask on again. "I am sorry, truly, but the family needs space." The family. As if I were not part of it. As if biology meant nothing when weighed against the narrative Michael and Vanessa curated so meticulously. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to push past her, but then Michael appeared in the doorway, somber in his expensive suit. The tragic, grieving son the world was meant to see. His expression hardened when he spotted me. "We talked about this, Emily. We need no scenes today. Go home. Mom would not want you ruining this moment." Those words hit harder than any physical blow. Ruining this moment, as if my presence itself contaminated her memory. The guard shifted uncomfortably, caught between obedience and compassion, but Vanessa nodded at him with icy certainty. "Keep to the list. She is not permitted." Snow flurried around us as I stood frozen, humiliated, disbelief warring with fury, so fierce it made my hands shake. People were watching, whispering, making assumptions I could practically hear. Maybe she was estranged. Maybe she was troubled. Maybe she deserved to be kept outside. And then the door closed again, shutting me out of the warmth, the candles, the music, and the mother. I was being denied the right to mourn. I sank onto the icy stone railing, my breath trembling, the lilies slipping in my numb fingers, and for the first time, I let myself wonder whether the years I spent caring for my mother had truly meant anything at all to the people who shared her blood. But beneath the humiliation, beneath the ache, a spark of something else flickered to life, something sharp and undeniable. Because if Michael had gone this far to keep me outside, then the truth he was hiding had to be far bigger than I ever imagined. I would have stayed frozen on that stone railing forever if not for the sudden shift in the crowd's murmurs, a ripple of attention that moved like a current through the guests. As Michael stepped back outside again this time with a face full of theatrical grief, placing a hand over his chest, as if my mere presence wounded him. "Emily, please do not make this harder," he said, loud enough for the gathering audience to hear, and the pitying glances sharpened into silent judgment. He wanted them to see me as unstable, unreasonable, the estranged daughter trying to insert herself where she did not belong. And the worst part was how easily they accepted the narrative because Michael had always been so good at performing sincerity. Vanessa moved behind him, touching his arm as if soothing him, playing the part of the supportive wife, while her eyes gleamed with triumph. And before I could speak, she leaned toward the guests and whispered just loud enough that fragments floated back to me, something about how I had not been there in Mom's final months, how I had chosen to distance myself, how grief made people do strange things. Lies, all of it lies, but lies delivered with enough confidence to become truth in the eyes of people who never cared enough to know the difference. I felt myself shrinking under their stares, shrinking into that familiar role I had been cast into my whole life, the role of the overlooked child, the one no one defended. But then someone from the doorway called for Michael because the service was about to begin, and without another glance at me, he turned to go inside. Vanessa followed, but not before leaning close enough for her breath to touch my cheek as she whispered, "You should have stayed out of the way, Emily, just like you always have." And then the door closed on me for the second time that morning. I stood there trembling, humiliated, the lilies crushed in my grip, and the cold felt harsher now. Not because of the weather, but because of the realization that Michael had orchestrated this spectacle deliberately, that keeping me outside was not an accidental cruelty, but a calculated choice meant to erase me completely from my mother's story. Guests filed inside as though nothing unusual had happened, offering me awkward half-smiles, the kind given to someone who has embarrassed herself in public, and with each passing second, the humiliation settled deeper, a weight pressing down on my spine. A soft voice broke through the numbness. "Miss Carter, you should come with me." It was Jonathan again, standing a few steps away, his eyes full of a solemn understanding that made something inside me crack. I followed him to a small alcove beside the chapel out of the wind where he studied my face with a mixture of sympathy and something sharper, something like restrained anger. "Your brother had no right to bar you from this service. Your mother would be devastated." His certainty startled me. How could he be so sure when Michael spent years convincing everyone, including Mom's own siblings, that I was unreliable, distant, ungrateful? "I do not know what he told you." I whispered, my voice raw, but everyone believes him. Jonathan shook his head slowly. "Your mother told me the truth, Emily. All of it. Every sacrifice. Every night you sat with her. Every moment you protected her dignity when others only pretended to care." My breath hitched. "She told you about me, about what I did." He nodded. "She knew more than you think. And she wanted to protect you from the harm your brother is still capable of. That is why she left instructions. That is why she left something behind." He opened the leather folder under his arm and withdrew a sealed envelope thick and heavy with my name written in my mother's unmistakable looping handwriting. My knees nearly gave out. The world around me blurred the wind, the murmurs, the faint sound of the organ beginning inside the chapel. All I could see was my name in her handwriting, the last words she would ever give me. With trembling fingers, I reached for it, but Jonathan held it back gently. "Not yet. There is a time and a place for this, and this moment is not it." "What do you mean?" I whispered, panic threading through my chest. He sighed, glancing toward the chapel doors. "Your mother wanted Michael to face the truth when he could not ignore it, and when you are strong enough to reveal it. Today may be that day, Emily, but you must choose when to use what she left you." His words struck me like a physical force, because in that instant I realized something that made my heart pound painfully against my ribs. Michael had fought so hard to keep me outside because he knew something was coming. Something my mother had kept from him, something powerful enough to shake the story he had woven for years. And the envelope in Jonathan's hand might be the very thing he feared most. The service ended before I even realized how much time had passed, signaled by the muted toll of the chapel bell and the slow spill of guests emerging in somber clusters, their coats pulled tight against the biting air, their faces arranged in masks of sympathy that felt hollow after what I had just endured. and I stood partly hidden behind the alcove wall, gripping the unopened envelope so hard the edges cut into my palm, afraid that if I moved even a step closer, Michael would find some new way to humiliate me. When the doors finally opened wide and the crowd began to disperse, Michael appeared first, flanked by Vanessa, accepting condolences with a saintly sorrow that made my stomach twist, and I watched him scan the parking lot with a practiced grief that looked perfect on him until his eyes landed on me. The flicker of annoyance that crossed his face was so quick most would have missed it, but I knew him too well. It was the look he gave just before trying to control the narrative again. He began to walk toward me, and Vanessa followed her heels, clicking sharply against the stone, each step punctuating the certainty that whatever they were about to say would be dipped in condescension. Before they reached me, Jonathan stepped forward, placing himself subtly between us, and for the first time since arriving, I felt the smallest spark of protection. Michael's smile tightened when he saw Jonathan standing at my side. "Emily," he said as though speaking to a misbehaving child, "I hope you used the time outside to collect yourself. We did not want anything upsetting during Mom's service." The hypocrisy stung so deeply I had to swallow hard to keep from choking on it. Vanessa chimed in smoothly, her voice dripping false compassion. "It was best this way. You know how emotional you get. We wanted to preserve the dignity of the moment." The dignity of the moment, as though my very existence threatened it. Jonathan's jaw tightened before he spoke. "Your mother's dignity was preserved by Emily more than anyone here." The air shifted, a small jolt of tension rippling outward, and Michael stiffened, the mask slipping for just a heartbeat before he forced it back into place. "Emily knows her role in this family," he said sharply, "and it is not to cause trouble." I felt heat flare in my chest, humiliation burning into something sharper, something dangerously close to anger. I opened my mouth, ready to finally push back, but Jonathan raised a hand, slightly stopping me. "Actually, she does have a role today," he said, reaching into his coat and withdrawing the envelope again, the cream-colored paper now bearing faint smudges from where my trembling hands had held it. He held it up just enough for Michael to see the handwriting. "Your mother left instructions, specific instructions, and Emily is the one meant to receive them." Michael's expression froze, and in that stillness, I saw the truth. He had known something like this might surface. His voice dropped to a hiss, barely contained. "What is that? Why was I not told?" "Because it was not for you," Jonathan replied calmly, and the simplicity of those words felt like a blow landed squarely against the fraud Michael had built his life upon. Vanessa stepped closer, her face tightening. "This seems highly unprofessional. We should discuss this privately." Jonathan shook his head. "The instructions are clear. Emily is to receive this document today, and she is to decide who sees it." My pulse hammered so loudly I could barely hear the murmurs beginning to rise among nearby guests who lingered, drawn in by the tension. Michael reached forward abruptly, as if he could snatch the envelope from Jonathan's hand by sheer entitlement. "Let me see it," he demanded, the veneer of grief cracking, something much darker slipping through. "No." The word left my lips before I even realized I had spoken, and in that moment, something inside me finally aligned, as though a lifetime of being diminished had crystallized into a single act of defiance. The shock on Michael's face was almost gratifying, and Jonathan's slight nod of approval bolstered me further. "You do not get to keep controlling everything," I said, my voice trembling but clear. "Not anymore." Guests nearby fell silent, watching, sensing something far more consequential than a family disagreement unfolding. Michael's voice lowered dangerously. "You think you can undermine me with whatever scraps she left you? Mom trusted me with everything. She trusted Emily too." Jonathan interjected, his tone unshakably firm. "In fact, she trusted her more. And if you try to interfere with her rights today, you will discover exactly how much legal weight your mother placed on her sacrifices." A flicker of fear, real fear, crossed Michael's face, and Vanessa's grip on his arm tightened. For the first time in years, I saw him unsure, caught without a script. But before I could push further, Jonathan leaned close and whispered, "Not here. Read it when you are ready." And then, with a final pointed glance at Michael, he stepped back, leaving me with the envelope that suddenly felt heavier than my entire grief. I did not read the letter immediately, even though every nerve in my body buzzed with the urge to tear it open. Instead, I walked away from the chapel steps, away from Michael's glare, and Vanessa's calculating eyes, away from the murmuring guests who kept glancing between us, like they were witnessing an unscripted scene in a carefully planned production, and I kept walking until I reached the far edge of the cemetery where the trees offered enough cover to breathe again. The cold air stung my face, the lilies drooped in my hand, and my heart felt like it was beating in two different rhythms, one for the grief I had not been allowed to express, and one for the rising anger that had replaced the humiliation Michael intended for me. I finally sat on a low stone bench beneath a leafless oak tree and stared down at the envelope with my mother's handwriting on it. The curves of each letter, undeniably hers, full of the gentleness she had always tried to give me, even when her strength faded. My hands shook as I slid a finger under the seal and unfolded the thick stationery inside. Her familiar scent lavender lotion and chamomile tea seemed to rise from the paper, and the sight of her handwriting blurred instantly as tears filled my eyes. Not from pain this time, but from the unbearable intimacy of her voice reaching across the divide of death. My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, it means I was not strong enough to say what I needed to say while I was still here. I know your brother controlled too much of the space around my illness, and I am sorry for that. My breath caught. She knew. She had seen more than I ever realized. She continued, "You were the one who carried me through these past 2 years. You were the one who stayed when others found excuses to leave. I never once believed Michael's stories about you being unreliable or unstable. I know who you are, Emily. I always have." The words broke me open. Years of being pushed aside, rewritten, diminished, suddenly unwinding beneath the truth only my mother could deliver. But then her tone shifted, becoming more deliberate, more purposeful. "I also need you to understand something important. Before I became too sick to fight, I changed my plans. I changed everything. Because I saw what Michael was doing, how he positioned himself to control everything after I was gone. He thought I did not know, but I did. And I refused to let him erase you." My heart pounded so hard I nearly dropped the letter. She continued, "I revised my will. The house, my savings, the life insurance, everything that was once intended for both of you is now solely in your name. I left nothing substantial to Michael, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. He has taken enough from you over the years, and I will not let him take the rest." The world tilted, my vision narrowing, as relief, disbelief, and fear collided inside me. She had left everything to me, not because I asked, not because I demanded, but because she saw. Because she finally acted to protect me in the way she had never dared to before. But there was more. I could feel it. And then I read the final paragraph's words so heavy they felt like they were carved into stone. "Emily, there is a second document in Jonathan's possession. It details things Michael has done, financial decisions he hid from me, debts he concealed, lies he wove so he could manipulate my care and your future. If he challenges my will, that document will be presented in court. It will ruin his reputation, his marriage, and possibly his freedom. I did not want this outcome for my son, but I will not allow him to destroy you to save himself. If he forces your hand, show no mercy." A sob escaped me raw, choking full of every swallowed injustice I had endured. My mother had not only believed me, she had prepared for the war Michael thought he could win unopposed. And then the final lines shattered what remained of my composure. "Please live freely when I am gone. Do not let the cruelty of others define your worth. You were my greatest comfort. You deserved more than I gave. Forgive me if you can. Love, always, Mom." I pressed the letter to my chest and cried until my entire body trembled because grief and vindication and heartbreak had collided all at once. And as the wind shifted through the bare branches, I knew with a clarity sharper than the winter air that Michael's attempt to erase me had failed. The real battle had just begun. I do not know how long I sat beneath that oak tree clutching my mother's letter like a lifeline, while the world around me blurred into soft grays and muted whispers of wind. But eventually I felt movement nearby, the faint crunch of footsteps on frost, and when I lifted my head, Jonathan was standing a respectful distance away, giving me the dignity Michael never had. He did not speak at first, just waited, his eyes gentle but unflinching, as though he understood that the storm inside me needed room before I could form words again. When I finally managed to breathe without choking on grief, I held out the letter, slightly unable to fully let go. She knew everything. I whispered, my voice hoarse. She knew what he did. Jonathan nodded slowly. Your mother was not blind, Emily. She spent a long time pretending Michael's behavior was temporary, that stress or pride made him harsh. But when her illness progressed, she saw the truth clearly, and she made choices accordingly. His words steadied me, grounding me just enough to pull myself together, and when I wiped my face with trembling fingers, a new resolve began tightening in my chest. What happens now? I asked, my voice small but steadying with each syllable. What am I supposed to do with this? Jonathan exhaled a breath that clouded faintly in the air. That depends on what your brother does next. Your mother's revised will is legally sound, witnessed, notarized, and filed correctly. But Michael will not accept being disinherited quietly. He has spent years positioning himself as the responsible one, the savior of the family. When he learns the truth, he will fight, and he will be vicious. The words should have scared me, but instead they lit something sharp and bright inside me, something forged from every moment I had swallowed my own voice to keep peace in a family that saw me as expendable. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, shielding it like a flame from the wind. When we walked back toward the chapel, the crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving only a handful of people lingering near the parking lot. But the moment Michael saw me reappear, his expression tightened with suspicion, as if he sensed something had shifted beyond his control. He strode toward us, Vanessa trailing behind him with her usual mix of arrogance and feigned concern. What did he give you? Michael demanded, his tone no longer even pretending to be soft for public perception. That envelope. What is in it? I held the letter against my chest, meeting his eyes for the first time without flinching. Something that was meant for me. Something Mom wanted me to have. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching violently as fear flickered behind his anger. He hated not knowing, hated not controlling the narrative, and I realized in that moment how fragile his power truly was, built entirely on the illusion that I would always stay silent. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice dripping poisonous sweetness. Emily, you are misunderstanding things. Michael handled everything for your mother. You were barely involved. You should show some gratitude instead of suspicion. I almost laughed. It was so absurd, so profoundly detached from the truth, that it felt like a parody of the lies they had relied on for years. I turned to Jonathan, silently asking for permission, and his small nod gave me the courage I needed. You both should leave, Jonathan said coolly. Emily has no obligation to discuss anything with you today. Michael's fury sharpened. She is my sister. She has every obligation to explain herself. No, I said quietly but firmly, I do not. Not anymore. And with those words, something shifted irrevocably between us. Michael stared at me as though seeing a stranger, someone who had stepped out of the role he had assigned her since childhood, and in his confusion, his voice cracked with something dangerously close to desperation. Emily, whatever you think Mom left you, it cannot matter more than keeping this family intact. Do not make a mistake you will regret. The irony nearly stole my breath. The family had been broken long before this moment, fractured by his manipulation, his entitlement, his belief that Mom's illness was an opportunity to consolidate control rather than to show compassion. The mistake would have been continuing to let him rewrite my place in her life. I stepped closer to him, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enough weight to make him recoil. The only thing I regret is letting you convince me for so long that I did not matter. Vanessa's eyes widened. Michael's face darkened, but before another word could be exchanged, Jonathan gently guided me toward the path leading to the parking lot. As I walked away, I felt Michael's angry stare burning into my back, but for the first time in years, it no longer hollowed me out. It fueled me. Because whether he knew it yet or not, the truth my mother left behind was a fuse. And Michael had spent years surrounding himself with the kind of lies that burned. I barely slept that night, replaying every moment at the funeral in a loop so relentless it felt like drowning, and by sunrise, my phone was already vibrating with the first barrage of messages from Michael, texts demanding explanations, voicemails dripping with forced concern, alternating between guilt, anger, and desperate attempts to reclaim control. But I ignored every one of them, letting his words pile up unheard, because for once in my life I did not owe him my attention. I spent the morning reading Mom's letter again and again, tracing the curves of her handwriting as if doing so might anchor me in the unfamiliar reality she had created, a reality in which she had chosen me, defended me, trusted me more than the son she had spent decades believing would lead the family. The weight of that truth was both comforting and terrifying. It felt like a door had opened, but stepping through meant letting go of the version of my family I had clung to out of survival. Around noon, Jonathan called and asked if he could stop by, and I said yes, grateful for even a sliver of clarity amidst the emotional wreckage. When he arrived, he carried not only the second document my mother had told me about, but additional folders, legal records, signed statements, financial summaries, all evidence of the lies Michael had constructed with such confidence that even I, who knew him best, had underestimated the extent of his manipulation. We sat at my small dining table, both of us quiet for a moment, before he began laying out the documents in careful order. "Emily," he said gently, "your mother wanted transparency. She wanted you to see the full picture before deciding how to proceed." And then he showed me everything. Bank transactions where Michael had used Mom's funds to cover his failing business debts without her knowledge. Forged signatures on medical decisions he had claimed she approved. A secret agreement he made with an assisted living facility, one he never intended to use, but presented to extended relatives to portray me as resistant to professional care. Lies upon lies upon lies, layered so intricately that they formed a cage around me, one designed to trap me in the role of the unreliable daughter so he could maintain control. I felt sick, my hands trembling as I sifted through pages stained with the residue of betrayal. He stole from her. I whispered, my throat tight. He stole from her while pretending to take care of her. Jonathan nodded solemnly, and he expected to inherit everything to cover those debts once she passed. That is why he pushed so hard to control her medical decisions, why he isolated you, why he shaped the narrative that you were unstable. But she saw through it eventually. She left these to protect you. I pressed my hands against my eyes, trying to steady my breath, but the truth was too large, too jagged to contain. Michael had not just taken advantage of Mom. He had built an entire facade around her illness, weaponizing her vulnerability while punishing me for refusing to play along. My grief twisted into something darker, not hatred exactly, but a cold, sharp clarity that made my next question feel like an inevitability. What happens when I file the will? Jonathan met my gaze with a calm I desperately needed. Michael will challenge it. He will claim you manipulated her. He will claim she was not of sound mind when she signed. He will attempt to drag your name through the mud. But we have her medical evaluations. We have her lawyer statements, and we have the truth he fears most evidence of his misconduct. If he pushes this, it will ruin him. A long silence settled between us as I absorbed the weight of the choice ahead. A choice that would not only shape my future, but strip Michael bare in ways he would never recover from. And then, Jonathan added something quietly, something that cut through me like a blade dipped in kindness. "You do not have to destroy him, Emily. You simply have to choose yourself. But sometimes choosing yourself means letting the consequences fall where they belong." His words echoed in the hollow space where my old loyalty used to live. I knew what Michael expected, that I would back down, that I would cling to the illusion of family, even if it meant sacrificing myself again. But Mom had seen that pattern, and she had chosen a different ending for me. By the time Jonathan left, the sun was setting in streaks of amber and rose over the city, and I stood at my window holding the envelope against my chest one last time before locking it away with the other documents. The next steps would be ugly, complicated, painful. But I finally understood something with absolute certainty. I would no longer be the sister standing outside in the cold while Michael controlled the door. This time, I would walk through on my own terms, even if the truth burned everything he had built to the ground. I filed the will 3 days later, stepping into the courthouse with a steadiness I did not entirely feel clutching the documents Jonathan had prepared, feeling the weight of my mother's final choices, like a hand pressed warm against my back, urging me forward. The clerk processed everything with practiced efficiency, unaware that her routine motions were dismantling the carefully constructed world Michael had ruled over for years. And when I walked back outside into the sharp winter light, I felt both terrified and strangely liberated, as though the air itself had thinned enough for me to take a fuller breath than I had in months. By the time I returned home, Michael had already learned what I had done. The first voicemail was furious, the second panicked, the third dripping with pleading disguised as brotherly concern. But it was the fourth message, the one whispered, trembling, half frantic, that confirmed what Jonathan predicted. He understood the stakes. "Emily, listen to me. We can fix this. Just call me. Do not do anything rash." The desperation in his voice should have satisfied me, but instead it carved a painful ache through my chest, a reminder that beneath all the cruelty and manipulation, he was still my brother. The boy who once let me borrow his coat in the rain, the boy who used to defend me from bullies before adulthood, turned him into the person I hardly recognized. Grief is a twisted thing. It tangles itself around love until the two become almost indistinguishable. And as much as I wanted to hate him, there was a part of me that mourned the brother he might have been if greed and pride had not hollowed him out. But mourning a possibility would not save me now. When Michael finally appeared at my apartment unannounced the next evening, pounding on the door with a frantic rhythm that made my heart lurch, I hesitated, not because I feared him physically, but because I feared the emotional gravity he had always wielded over me, pulling me back into patterns of guilt and appeasement. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. He looked terrible, his tie loosened, eyes bloodshot, hair disheveled in a way I had not seen since he was a teenager who overslept exams, and for a fleeting second pity softened something inside me. But then he spoke. "How could you do this to me?" he demanded, shoving past me into the living room as though he still controlled every space I inhabited. "You know the business is struggling. You know I needed that inheritance to stabilize things. Mom trusted me to handle everything, not you." The entitlement in his voice was so baked in, so instinctual, that I felt my pity evaporate, replaced by a calm anger that made my words sharper, steadier. "Mom changed her will because she trusted me more. She saw what you were doing. She saw what you stole." Michael's face twisted, the mask cracking fully now. "I did what I had to do," he spat. "I kept the family afloat while you were off pretending to be some saintly caretaker. You think sitting beside a hospital bed is the same as responsibility? I paid the bills. I made the decisions, and I would not have had to if you had just done your part." The absurdity of his claim nearly stunned me into silence. "My part," I whispered. "My part was cleaning her, feeding her, helping her breathe when pain stole her voice." "Your part was stealing from her." He recoiled as though struck, but the panic in his eyes grew, morphing into desperation, and suddenly he fell into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "Emily, please," he said, and his voice cracked so completely it startled me. "If this will stand, I am ruined. The creditors will come after me, the business will collapse, Vanessa will leave me. I will lose everything." For a long moment, I just watched him, this man who had once been my childhood protector, now unraveling under the weight of consequences he never imagined would reach him. A small part of me ached for him, but another part, the part built from years of being silenced, knew pity could not guide me now. "You lost everything the moment you decided you deserved more than the rest of us," I said quietly. "Mom gave you every chance to be better. You chose this." He lifted his head, eyes bloodshot and hollow. "You would really destroy me to prove a point." I shook my head. "This is not about destroying you. This is about ending what you did to her, what you did to me. I am choosing myself for the first time in my life. And if that destroys you, maybe you should ask why the truth is strong enough to do that." His shoulders slumped, a defeated exhale leaving him like air from a punctured tire, and for the first time in years, I saw him without the armor of arrogance, small, frightened, exposed. Then he whispered something so soft I almost missed it. "I did not think she would ever choose you." And that was when I realized the truth that explained everything. Michael had not resented my absence. He had resented my presence, because deep down, he always feared Mom's love for me was stronger than the story he crafted. Now, he would face the proof. Michael left my apartment that night looking like a man walking toward his own execution, and for a brief, foolish moment, I wondered if the situation might deflate quietly, if he might accept the will, confront his debts, rebuild his life without dragging me into another storm. But by the next morning, the fantasy shattered when Jonathan called to tell me Michael had hired an attorney, one known for aggressive reputation-shredding tactics, and had already initiated a formal challenge to the will on the grounds of diminished capacity and undue influence, the exact accusations my mother had predicted he would use to strike at me. The betrayal stung not because I expected better from him, but because some fragile part of me had hoped the letter, the truth. The collapse of his mask would be enough to make him stop fighting for a throne built from ashes. Instead, he doubled down. The filings arrived at my apartment hours later, certified mail I had to sign for, and when I opened the packet, the words jumped off the page like venom. Claims that I manipulated our mother during her illness, that I isolated her, that I coerced her into revising her will, that I had a history of emotional instability that made me unfit to serve as a beneficiary. Reading it felt like drowning in mud. Every lie was a distortion of the truth in the cruelest possible direction, and though Jonathan had warned me it would happen, nothing could have prepared me for seeing my own life rewritten in legal language crafted to erase my sacrifices and portray me as a parasite. For a moment, I could not breathe. I sat on the kitchen floor with the paper spread around me, my vision blurring as if the words themselves refused to hold still, and a wave of grief so sharp it almost toppled me, crashed over my chest, not just for my mother, not just for myself, but for the brother I had lost long before this battle began. A brother who had once held my hand on the first day of school, yet now wielded the law like a blade aimed at my throat. When I finally managed to stand, something in me hardened a quiet resolve, replacing the panic. I called Jonathan, my voice steadier than I felt, and told him I was ready to fight. He arrived within the hour, his presence calm and grounding, and for the first time since filing the will, I felt the faintest thread of hope tug at my ribs. We went through each accusation point by point, and he showed me exactly how the truth dismantled the lies, medical records documenting Mom's cognitive clarity in the months before she passed, notarized dates showing when the revisions were made, statements from the hospice nurses who had witnessed my care firsthand, financial logs revealing the discrepancies tied directly to Michael's accounts, evidence real and irrefutable built from the very paper trail Michael thought he had buried. Still, resentment simmered beneath my ribs as I studied the documents because even with the truth on my side, the process would be long, public, humiliating. Michael knew it. He was counting on it. He was counting on me breaking under pressure the way I had always folded under his disappointment growing up. But he had forgotten something crucial. People who have lived their whole lives being underestimated eventually learn how to turn invisibility into armor. The hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later, and in that time, Michael escalated everything, calling relatives to tell them I had betrayed the family, spreading rumors that I had taken advantage of a dying woman, sending me messages that swung wildly between threats and pleas. Vanessa chimed in as well, painting herself as the loyal daughter-in-law, trying to protect her husband from my supposed greed. Each message cut, but each message also fueled me, sharpening my resolve until it gleamed like glass. The night before the hearing, I sat alone in my apartment with the envelope of my mother's letter on the table beside me. I read it again, letting her words settle into the cracks where Michael's cruelty had once lived. She believed you. She chose you. She trusted you. That truth wrapped around my heart like a shield, and as I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, I felt something shift inside me, an understanding that the hearing tomorrow was not just about inheritance, not just about legal truth. It was about reclaiming the part of myself Michael had spent years convincing me was small, secondary, disposable. When morning came, I dressed deliberately. Choosing a navy dress my mother always said made me look unyielding. And when I walked into the courthouse, Jonathan at my side, and saw Michael already seated at the opposing table, flanked by his attorney and wearing a mask of righteous indignation, something unexpected happened. A calm settled over me, deeper than courage, steadier than fear. Because no matter what accusations he hurled, no matter how loudly he screamed his version of the truth, I finally understood that he had already lost the moment Mom put her faith in me instead of him. And today, everyone else would see why. The courtroom felt colder than the winter morning outside its fluorescent lights, washing every face into a palette of pale tension. But as I took my seat beside Jonathan and glanced across the aisle at Michael, something in me settled with a quiet, immovable certainty. Because while he sat stiffly in his tailored suit, jaw clenched and eyes burning with the brittle intensity of a man cornered by consequences he never believed would touch him, I felt none of the fear he expected, only a steady resolve born from the letter tucked safely in my bag, the truth that had been waiting years for this moment. His attorney began with a performance so polished it almost sounded believable, weaving a narrative of a devoted son betrayed by his unstable sister, emphasizing my supposed emotional volatility, my alleged isolation of our mother, my suspicious involvement in the revision of the will. And with each sentence, I felt the sting of being twisted into a villain in a story I had nearly died trying to survive. But Jonathan rested a gentle hand on my arm, grounding me, reminding me silently that truth has a different weight than lies. They may both echo, but only one stands when the room grows quiet. When it was our turn, Jonathan rose with the calm assurance of a man holding a loaded truth, and instead of attacking, he began with the simplest, quietest piece of evidence. My mother's cognitive evaluations dated, notarized, signed by medical professionals, confirming her clarity of mind during the exact period when she revised her will, and the shift in the room was immediate, subtle, but undeniable, as though the air itself recognized the difference between conjecture and fact. Then came the hospice nurse statements delivered through sworn affidavits that described not a manipulative daughter, but a devoted caregiver, the one who attended every appointment, administered every medication, soothed every panic attack. And when those words were read aloud, something in my chest cracked open, not in pain, but in validation, so profound it made my throat tighten because for the first time, the version of me that my mother saw was being acknowledged in a space where Michael's lies had no power. Jonathan did not stop there. He moved next to the financial evidence bank transfers, forged documents, inconsistencies that matched Michael's accounts, but not mine. And as his attorney scrambled to interrupt, to object, to redirect, the judge's expression grew less sympathetic, more wary, and Michael's mask began to crumble at the edges. His breathing quickened, his foot tapped uncontrollably. His eyes darted between the judge, the documents, and me, as though he were watching the floorboards of his constructed narrative splinter beneath him. The final blow arrived when Jonathan introduced the sealed document my mother had entrusted to him, the one detailing Michael's concealed debts, his manipulations, his attempts to mislead both her and extended family members about my involvement. Michael lurched forward in his seat, then whispering harshly to his attorney. But it was too late. The judge accepted the document, skimmed its contents, and when she looked up, her eyes settled on him with a cold, discerning clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. The truth had landed, and it was devastating. When she finally ruled, her voice was steady and firm, stating unequivocally that the will was valid, that there was no evidence of undue influence, that my mother had acted with full capacity and intention, and that Michael's challenge not only lacked merit, but appeared to be motivated by financial desperation and personal animosity. I did not realize I had been holding my breath until the air returned to my lungs in a trembling rush, and for a moment the room blurred, not with fear this time, but with the overwhelming release of a burden I had carried alone for too long. Michael's face drained of color as the judge added that his misconduct with our mother's accounts would be forwarded for further investigation, civil and potentially criminal, and Vanessa, who had been sitting behind him, slowly lifted her purse and stood her expression tight with humiliation and dawning self-preservation as she slipped out of the courtroom without even touching his shoulder. The moment the gavel fell, silence washed through the room like a cleansing wave. Jonathan squeezed my hand once gently and whispered, "It is over. You did it." But as I rose from my chair, knees weak with relief, I knew something deeper. I had not destroyed my brother. He had destroyed himself long before this day. All I had done was stop shielding him from the consequences. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun broke through the clouds, soft and bright, warming the cold air, as if the universe itself exhaled with me. And when I opened my bag to reread the last line of my mother's letter, "Please live freely when I am gone," I realized for the first time that I finally could.